Her youthful imagination, uncontaminated as yet, ignorant of anything more impassioned than the almost platonic affection of a septuagenarian husband, carried her away into a land of dreams, a land where the modesty of woman had nothing to fear from the chastity of man, where the senses were vanquished and fettered, and soul communed with soul and mingled in harmony complete and almost divine. Her advisers returned. The final arrangements were made. She refused to write or to speak, but she agreed to remain all day in the palace and to follow the messenger who would be sent to fetch her in the evening. The hours passed wearily away, and sitting in expectant terror, the poor girl kept her eyes fixed alternately on the swift hand of the clock and at the door, now closed and silent, through which the harbinger of her doom would enter. At 10:30, there was a knock. She was hastily muffled in a cloak. A hat with a thick veil was placed on her head, and she was led, bewildered and half unconscious, into the street where a carriage awaited her. Into this she was hurriedly thrust. A man in a long coat and round hat, who held the door open for her, pulled up the step and seated himself by her side. Not a word was exchanged on the way. The carriage stopped at a secret entrance to the great palace. They got out, and her companion, half led, half carried her to a door, which was eagerly opened by someone from within. She was placed in an armchair. She found herself in Napoleon's presence, but she could not see him for her tears. Kneeling at her feet, he began to speak reassuringly to her, but presently the words, "Your old husband," escaped him. She uttered a cry, sprang from the chair, and tried to escape, her sobs choking her utterance. At the words, the fault she was about to commit rose before her in all its horror, all its degradation, all its ignominy. And as if by a sudden inspiration, she realized its infamy. He, for his part, gazed at her in astonishment, understanding nothing of what was passing in her mind. Never had he found himself in such a position. What sort of a woman was this, whose virtue had yielded after some persuasion, certainly, but no very great pressure, for he knew nothing of the means employed, who had come to a midnight assignation, and who was now sobbing wildly and flying to the door? Was she a coquette of marvelous histrionic powers, or a simpleton of phenomenal ignorance? Was it all a piece of acting meant to increase his ardor? No, these are cries that cannot be simulated, impulsive movements that cannot be feigned, especially by a girl of 18. With gentle violence, he brought her back from the door to which she was clinging and placed her again in her chair. Then, in a voice full of caressing kindness, in spite of the habitual tone of command that rang in it occasionally, almost against his will, he questioned her, carefully avoiding words or suggestions that might wound her, and choosing such paraphrases as he judged least offensive, yet by the irresistible logic of his method, drawing from her faltering replies, each of which he presently turned to account against her. Was her union with the man whose name she bore a voluntary act on her part? Was it his wealth and title that had tempted her? What could have induced her to mate her youth, her fresh beauty, with the decrepitude of advanced old age? Her mother had arranged the marriage. Surely, then, you can have no scruples in the matter, he cried. Whereupon she took refuge in her religion. What God hath joined together, man may not put asunder. Napoleon laughed. Her indignant tears burst forth afresh. Truly, this was no ordinary woman. He thought of her as some strange fruit, the flavor of which was unknown to him. A woman who clung desperately to her marriage vows, her religious principles, and yet had come in response to his summons to this midnight assignation. He determined to clear up the mystery and plied her again with questions about her education, the sort of life she led in the country, the society to which she was accustomed, her mother, her family. He wished to know all about her, more particularly her baptismal name, Marie, the name by which he always addressed her henceforth. At 2:00, someone knocked at the door. What, ready? He exclaimed. Well, my pretty plaintive dove, go and rest. You must not fear the eagle. The only power he claims over you is that of a passionate love, a love that will be satisfied with nothing short of your whole heart. You will love him in time, for in all things you shall command him in all things, do you hear? He wrapped her cloak about her and led her to the door. Then placing his hand on the latch, he vowed he would not lift it unless she would promise to return the next day. She entered her own house calmer, more assured. Her dreams seemed to her not impossible of realization. He was kind and gentle to her. He had shown no violence. He had spared her once. Would he not spare her again? By 9 o'clock the next morning, the confidante was at her bedside, a large parcel in her hand, which she unpacked after carefully closing the door. She discovered several red Morocco cases, a bouquet of hothouse flowers mingled with laurels, and a sealed letter. But when she unclasped the cases and, taking out a magnificent parure of diamonds, held it so as to catch the light, Madame Valeska snatched the gems from her and hurled them across the room. She insisted that they should be sent back at once. Did he think she was to be bought with jewels? The messenger seemed little concerned at this outburst. She broke the seal and read the following letter. Marie, my sweet Marie, my first thought is of you. My first desire is to see you again. You will come, will you not? You promised. If you fail, the eagle will fly to you himself. I shall see you at dinner. My friend tells me, deign to accept this bouquet. Let it be a secret link binding us together in the midst of the crowd. It will enable us to communicate under the very eyes of the multitude. When I press my hand upon my heart, you will know that it is dreaming of you. Touch your bouquet and reply, love me, my Marie, and keep your hand constantly on your bouquet. And in spite of the letter, she declined to accept either diamonds, flowers, or laurels. Her excuse in the case of the bouquet being that it was not usual to wear flowers except at balls. She felt that it would be useless to try and escape the dinner. All around her were in favor of expectation, self-interest, and ambition. Her relatives intoxicated by her successes. Her husband absolutely unsuspicious, unconscious of the drama in which he was an involuntary actor. He was delighted at the numerous invitations they received. On her arrival, the whole company clustered round her. Those who were unknown to her begged to be presented. She felt as if her adventure of the night before must be known to all the guests. The emperor was already present. He frowned and looked displeased, flashing the keen light of an offended eye upon the newcomer. Suddenly she saw him advancing abruptly towards her, and trembling at the thought of some public scene, some irreparable scandal, she remembered and laid her hand on the spot where her bouquet should have been. In a moment his features relaxed. The flame died down in his eyes. He made an answering sign with his own hand, and before passing into the dining room, he called to Rock and whispered a few rapid words in his ear. Scarcely had she taken her usual seat by the Grand Marshal before he attacked her on the subject of the bouquet. She retorted by a counterattack on the present of the diamonds. Let it be understood once for all that she would accept no such gifts. How indeed could they suppose that she would dare to appear in such ornaments? The only offering her admiration and devotion led her to look for from the emperor was a ray of hope for the future of her country. Has not that offering already been made? Inquired de Rock. And he recalled a long series of actions which he declared to be infinitely more significant than promises. And as to his love for her, was it possible that she could question it? She might see that he had no eyes for anyone but herself. Apparently absorbed in general conversation, asking questions and listening attentively to the answers, he laid his hand perpetually on his heart. When the emperor had spoken to de Rock before dinner, he had desired him to remind her of her promise and implore her to come without fail as before. Then the Grand Marshal launched out into a dissertation on the miseries of greatness, the longing of such a sovereign as his master for a heart that should beat in sympathy with his own, the glory of a mission which any woman might envy. Having gone once, she could not refuse to go again. The same precautions were observed. She was conducted to the same place. As she entered, she saw that Napoleon looked gloomy and ill at ease. At last he exclaimed, hardly hope to see you again. He took off her hat and cloak, placed her in a chair, and standing over her, asked her harshly how she could justify her conduct. Why had she come to Bronia? Why had she tried to inspire in him a feeling she could not return? Why had she refused his flowers, even his laurels? What had she done with him? He had hoped for so many interesting moments in connection with them, and she had robbed him of these. His hand had scarcely left his heart all the evening, but she had made no sign. Only once had she responded, and striking his forehead with a passionate gesture, he exclaimed, "You are a true Pole. You have fully confirmed my former opinion of your nation." Greatly troubled by this reception and utterly overcome by these last words, she could only murmur, "Sire, tell me what your opinion is." He declared that all Poles were capricious and impulsive. All their actions were the result, not of principle, but of whim. Their enthusiasm was impetuous, noisy, and easily awakened, but they could never control nor sustain it. Was not this a portrait of the Poles in general, a true likeness of herself in particular? Had she not rushed to meet him on his entry like one possessed? His heart had been ensnared by her sweet glances, her passionate expressions, and then she had vanished. He had sought her everywhere in vain, and when she had appeared, one of the last to welcome him, she had become an icicle, but she must understand him. The thought of impossibilities only nerved him to renew effort. Nothing could turn him aside from a quest in which he had once engaged. Difficulties only spurred him on. Long accustomed to ready submission from all with whom he came in contact, her resistance challenged him to put forth all his strength. His excitement grew as he talked. Anger, perhaps real, perhaps only feigned, glowed in his words. You shall, yes, I repeat it, you shall love me. I have restored the name of your country. It owes its very existence to me. I will do more than just this for it. But look at this watch in my hand. Just as I dash it to fragments before you, so I will shatter Poland and all your hopes if you drive me to desperation by rejecting my heart and refusing me yours. Terrified by these threats and the violent gesture with which he threw the watch from him, the unhappy woman sank helpless on the floor. When she recovered from her swoon, the long conflict was over, and the victor was beside her, wiping away the tears that rolled slowly from her eyes. The liaison, if we may give the name to the habit she now contracted of a daily visit to the palace, was an accomplished fact. With passive resignation, she endured caresses, the price of which she still looked for in vain. The little she had obtained so far, a form of provisional government, the creation of the nucleus of an army, the enrollment of a few companies of light cavalry under the French emperor's standards, was not the indemnity she had promised herself for her surrender, or rather her capture. The restoration of Poland as a state-nation was the only boon which could either satisfy her aspirations or justify her in her own eyes. Incapable of feigning what she could not feel, or of simulating a passion from which her modesty recoiled, she had none of the qualities by which a more wily mistress might have played upon her lover. She was not even astute enough to conceal the true motive of her compliance from him. Every evening she brought the conversation round to the one subject that filled her mind, and always to be met with vague hopes and promises of action in the future, that future in which she now began to foresee a long-drawn agony of indefinite duration. Not that she suffered from any social degradation among her compatriots, with the one exception of her husband, from whom she had separated. All the members of her former circle were assiduous in the homage offered, not to the favorite, but to the victim, for her sufferings were known to all, and inspired universal pity and respect. Her husband's two sisters, Princess Jablonovska and Princess Berginska, had constituted themselves her chaperones. Had she been so minded, she might have occupied the first place in society at Warsaw, and any other woman would have exercised all but sovereign powers. Such a one would have made enemies, whereas she, modest, retiring, and unpretentious, was neither feared nor hated, and in default of flattery, tasted sympathy. Her position, indeed, created no scandal in a society where the simplicity of Oriental polygamy was complicated only by the elegant skepticism borrowed from Versailles, where the moral lessons of Catherine the Great have been learned and assimilated, and where divorce readily gave legal and even religious sanction to extraconjugal fancies. There was not one among the great Polish nobles of the day without either an acknowledged mistress who took her place in the same society with his wife, or some 2 or 3 Georgians in his country house. In the eyes of these nobles, Napoleon was a peculiarly chaste sovereign, for he made war and brought no harem in his train. He had disregarded all the women who would gladly have accepted his advances. He had desired but one among them, and even for this one he had been content to wait until she came to him of her own free will. Their own conduct in the matter seemed to them not only natural but becoming. A companion was necessary for the emperor's happiness when he took up his residence in Warsaw, and it was their business to provide him with the woman who pleased him best. Fortunately for them, this woman happened to be 1 in 1,000, simple, sincere, modest, disinterested, animated in all she did by a passionate love for her country, capable of inspiring both ardent passion and lasting affection, a type of all that was most lovable and generous in her nation. She would be no temporary mistress to Napoleon, but a kind of supplementary wife, who, though she would not share the splendors of his throne nor the dignities of his crown, would hold a unique position as the ambassadress of her people to the emperor, his Polish wife. She would knit Napoleon's heart to the destinies of Poland with a bond which, though as yet intangible, her hand would strengthen by degrees. This reasoning was by no means extravagant. Almost every evening the national problem was pressed upon him by the woman whose once absorbing thought it had become. He felt and often said to her that she loved not him but her country. Far from evading the charge, she frankly admitted its truth, and he, who would have distrusted any woman he suspected of a desire to lead or make use of him, gave his full confidence to the simple girl. He recognized her absolute detachment from the ambitions of ordinary women. He longed to satisfy her, and yet, bankrupt debtor that he was, he could not pay the price she had a right to expect.